Always wanted walkout music, and now I think I can die happy that was able to walk out to music. It's great to see you all here, or not see you all here. But it's dangerous to ask a law professor their opinion on more or less anything, but I will do my best to keep it within the allotted time frame. So I think privacy has a problem. And by that, I don't mean all that we consider to be privacy, but rather the term itself has a problem. And that's that it doesn't really mean anything, if it ever did. Privacy has ceased to be an effective term to guide policy in the United States and around the world. I think because it could mean so many different things that what usually happens is we end up talking past each other in a number of different instances where we might actually agree if we just defined what this term meant. And so, let me give an example. Earlier this year, Facebook rolled out their new graph search feature. And I know that most of you are probably, certainly that are Facebook users, are probably now familiar with that feature. And initially, of course, as it happens anytime there's a new product rollout for any kind of social technology, the hands went up and people said, well, now there are going to be some privacy issues with this. And Facebook and a lot of other journalists and other advocates wrote back and to try to assuage our fears, and they said, well, there aren't really going to be any privacy issues with this because nobody new is seeing your information. The same people that could see your information before will now have the same visibility that they could afterwards. And so there's no privacy problems associated with that. I think this is problematic. I actually think that this is wrong. I think that this argument is based on a common misunderstanding of the privacy implications of sharing information, particularly socially, with one another. And one of the points that I hope to make today is that the law is terrible about this. The law is very inconsistent about trying to determine when self-disclosed information is private. And what I think we usually end up doing in many various different contexts in the law is saying, well, did you disclose it to a lot of other people? You did? Not private. Or it's public. And you hear this argument all the time. As a matter of fact, earlier today, one of our panelists made the assertion that if you post something on Facebook, then it's out there and it's public. And I'd like to push back on that because I don't think that's reality. It may be that we feel that way, but that's not, I think, how most people consider their communications, nor do I think it's the desirable state that we should steer our privacy policy. Because I think that there's a distinction between information that is theoretically accessible by some and perhaps universally consumed by a significantly larger group. So, and Jason actually brought up earlier today the Irving Goffman, and Irving kind of gets into a lot of this with, well, we disclose some kinds of information to some people, but we would wish to withhold that information from others. And one of the metaphors that's been used is kind of this front stage and the backstage, and we need a place where we can perform front stage and then let our hair down backstage, and where our front stage might be for some people, it could be different for other people. So, by a show of hands, and I do think I can make out hands here, how many here have personal information that exists somewhere online, but you are so thankful that it is not indexed by a general search engine like Google or Bing? Show of hands, just generally speaking. Okay, so that's at least half. I think the other half of you are probably lying, or at least you're not thinking about it, because unless you are maybe in the 1% of the, and maybe this is the wrong audience to ask, I get a different result when I ask my students who start to think about the things that they posted about 5 years ago and say, yeah, I'm really glad that doesn't show up in Google. How many people here have taken advantage of some kind of access control or privacy setting on a social technology? So you utilize, see, all the hands shoot up. Who here has tried to use either a pseudonym or some kind of name variant? So for me, I would be Woody or WH or the Woodman or the Woodster. Anyone here? All right, so most of you. And finally, how many of you, and I want you to think about this for a second, how many of you have posted something online in a social way, so in some kind of social communication, and you knew that it was going to a relatively large audience, but you crafted your communication in such a way that would only be understood by a small group of people. So for example, could log on to Facebook and I would say, I totally nailed it. And my friends that didn't know I was taking a test would have no idea what that means. My friends that knew that I'd been studying for the bar exam for the past 3 months would say, all right, way to go. So who's done something like that intentionally? So a pretty good show of hands. So everyone that raised their hand has utilized or relied upon something that I think we all rely upon to protect our privacy, perhaps more than anything else, and that's the concept of obscurity. And the concept of obscurity is a context in which information has a very low probability of being found or understood by people that you don't want to find or understand it. I think it's relied upon not only in our online interaction, but as a part of our everyday life. And I bring this up because I think that this is an extremely underdeveloped legal concept, and I think it's an extremely, although perhaps less so, underdeveloped design concept. I think that we could embrace this concept better moving forward as a way to ease numerous tensions in the law and be a little bit more specific about what we're talking about when we say that term privacy, which I think is a very problematic term, or at least it's so value-laden and stretched that it's really not helpful anymore. So I hope to make 3 points during this talk. First, I hope to define online obscurity, and maybe obscurity more generally, in a clear and useful way. I hope to point out areas in which the law has been terrible about recognizing obscurity where it should, and areas where the law has implicitly valued obscurity, but that's not the term that we use to describe it. And I think that this framework could help us justify a lot of laws that we might question as ineffective. And finally, I want to propose a few different ways that we could embrace obscurity even better, both in the law and in the design of technologies that deal with personal information. So first, what does it mean to be obscure? We experience the concept of obscurity all the time in our everyday life. Most of our daily experience is actually lived largely in a zone of obscurity, our social setting. So consider, for example, the plane ride that you took to get here. Can you remember the face of more than one person that was on that plane? I'm guessing probably not, unless you have an incredible memory, in which case, bravo. But you probably only remember 1 or 2 people. When you sit at a restaurant, people sit all around you, but you don't listen to most of their conversations, nor do you even register that they're there. You're living life in this zone of obscurity. I think that obscurity is the reason that the statement, "you have no privacy in public," is dead wrong. I think that we recognize, at least we desire and count on having privacy in public all the time. For example, I lead off my privacy seminar every semester by asking the question, do we have any privacy in public? And I kind of phrase it in a way where I'm kind of telegraphing the idea, and my students say, oh, no, there's no privacy in public. And I, when public is secret, I can see that. And I say, okay, so if a drone were to fly overhead and take a picture of me walking outside of the law school, would I have any reasonable expectation of privacy in that? And my students inevitably say, no, absolutely not. And then I say, okay, what if that same drone was assigned to me and it followed me everywhere I went in public, to every single space? It never violated, it never looked inside my home, it never followed me inside a building, it only monitored my public comings and goings for a solid year. Then would my privacy have been violated? And my students squirm a little because they inevitably want to say yes because they know that they just committed to the statement that there's no privacy in public, but there's something inherently wrong about that activity versus, say, the snapshot that came out of nowhere. And so I think that obscurity is a concept that can help us ease this tension. We simply have a very low probability of any kind of harm in most of our daily occurrences. We rely upon structural protections, we rely upon contextual protections to protect us all the time. And this is increasingly happening online. And so I think that it's a valued concept in the law in some instances, but the law does a very poor job of recognizing the value of obscurity in social technologies, because what we tend to do is fall back on the password. It's an easy line to draw, right? And you've read cases, I'm sure, and you've had conversations with people that went something along the lines of, well, they posted it online, and then the response was, did you put it behind a password? Like, yeah, but okay, well, it's private. And we tend to recognize the password as this kind of talisman where, oh, well, maybe things were protected. But there are lots of things that can control access and limit the probability of something being found or understood besides passwords. And so I think judges could do a much better job of realizing the value of context, which of course gets at Helen Nissenbaum's theory of contextual integrity, privacy as contextual integrity. Courts have somewhat recognized obscurity. Obscurity kind of has an older sibling. As some of you recall, the case of Department of Justice versus Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, which had to do with a FOIA request for a rap sheet that aggregated lots of different violations through dusty old courthouses in the United States. And that request was denied on personal privacy grounds because it was seen that trying to figure out whether someone committed a crime in lots of different places scattered throughout was very different than having information aggregated all in one place, because the structural protections and the transactional costs were so high as to make the likelihood that anyone would find that information very low. And so using that, I think that we can kind of broaden this concept and explore it a little more to resolve some of the tensions that we see in privacy law right now. So courts could do a better job of recognizing it. I think lawmakers could do a better job of recognizing it. Lawmakers might actually want to utilize obscurity to justify laws that are already on the books, but seen as largely ineffective. So the Driver's Privacy Protection Act, which many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with, limits the collection of certain kinds of information. And there are lots of regulations and statutes that limit the collection of certain kinds of information. And a lot of this information is known by lots of different people. Things like your home address, your zip code, other pieces of information that it's difficult to justify. So I have conversations with my mom all the time. It's like, your address isn't private. And in the abstract, it probably isn't, because you can find it in lots of different places. But it could be justified as a way to protect the obscurity of information by making it more difficult to find or understand. Okay, so how do I define obscurity, at least in the online context? There are really 4 different ways. One is search, we use the lock and key metaphor. And it used to be that passwords were kind of the lock and key to privacy, but I think there are lots of different things that can make information more or less obscure. And so there are 4 factors, the presence of which makes information less obscure, and the absence of which makes information more obscure. So these things are search visibility. Can you find something either at the site level or at Google? If not, if it's dead to search, then it's kind of dead to the world, isn't it? At least as a general matter. Unprotected access, not just passwords, but encryption, privacy settings, visibility settings. I catch a lot of flack for protecting my Twitter account, and it's only for bots. I welcome all of you to follow. I'm trying to hide from bots, and I'm trying to exert a certain amount of control over basically generalized public access. So I decrease the likelihood of people finding. I'm not saying it's perfectly safe, but in many ways I consider obscurity to be good enough privacy. Identification. Do I use some kind of a name variant? If it's harder to link my identity to something, then I've got a greater probability of protection. So basically what I'm trying to do here is reduce the odds. If I post something online as Woody, that's better than Woodrow Hartzog, but certainly less good than WH, and certainly less good than a completely made-up pseudonym. And so there are degrees here. And finally, clarity. We produce obscurity as individuals all the time, and we might even know that that's what we're doing. But when I log onto Facebook and I say, it's positive, and you say, I have no idea what that means. Well, it only makes sense if you know that my wife and I are trying to conceive, and then you say, oh, great job, congratulations. And so how can obscurity be better implemented in the law? I think that there are probably 3 different ways. So the first is we could try to ease up on what's been called the public-private dichotomy. Something's either completely private and it's completely protected and we're gung-ho about it, or it's public. And if you want any kind of privacy protection in it, too bad. I think that we can plot information along a continuum where something is either the most obscure or it is the most obvious. And it lets us, I think, get a more nuanced sense of how valuable this information is and how protected it should be. One of the things that I think we could explore is having agreements to maintain obscurity. Confidentiality agreements are extremely important for lots of different kinds of information. But there's lots of information that we might not mind you sharing with other people. We just don't want you to put it online. We just don't want you to associate our name with it. And so why not we try to engage in a few more agreements where we say, hey, buddy, I'll share this with you, but you got to promise not to make it less obscure than it is right now. And so don't put it online. Don't disclose it behind certain visibility settings. Don't associate my name with it. Don't provide any more information that will allow others to kind of decode the meaning for this. And so it's a way to kind of move past our confidentiality agreement or nothing with respect to online agreements. And finally, I think that obscurity could be a design strategy. So for those that are designing social technologies, we wrestle a lot with, well, how do we completely protect people when they want to disclose information to some but not others? And I think the goal should actually be to allow users to create their own obscurity, because it's something that we very naturally rely on, and it works for most kinds of information. I think that it's a mistake to try to value information as simply public or simply private. And so when we allow users to kind of create their own obscurity, I think that that's much more beneficial than when trying to design for maybe something else like confidentiality. All right, so in conclusion, I think that obscurity is a really important privacy protective state that has been virtually ignored in most aspects of the law, and it's something that could help ease a lot of tensions in our need to disclose information to some people, but not to all. So thank you very much.